I am Frank Bongiorno, and I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And Chris Wallace, Professor Chris Wallace, wishes to be associated with my acknowledgement of country, and of course, I also introduce Chris. So, Chris is a professor. And I never can get the numbers in this title.
It's redundant. It's been
You don't do that anymore.
School of Politics, Economics and
There
Society.
you go. At the University of Canberra, and I'm a professor here at the School of History at ANU. But we've both been at ANU. We're both ANU alumni, aren't we?
Yeah, you did your PhD here.
I did.
I did mine here too, but I also did my BA in Politics and History back in the day.
Yeah, there you go.
Manning Clark was still wandering around in his hat.
Yeah, he was still around when I started my PhD, but not for long. I think I started in, February 1991, and he died in May 1991. So
You're a high correlation with Manning Clark.
I had nothing to do with it, I can assure you. But anyway, it's let's get on to tonight's topic, which is kind of on politics. So we've both written books recently. Chris's, is a wonderful study of, well, tell us, Chris. I mean, it's prime ministerial biography, but prime ministerial biography of a particular type.
That's true, but essentially we've both written books of political history. Frank's appears to be a book of political history and indeed is a very good book of Australian political history. Mine is a cunningly disguised political history wrapped in the capsule of biography, which of course is tremendously popular. People are much more likely to read about biography than history, even though history itself is popular. But as Frank says, it's got a very specific purpose and focus. It's a book about the biographies written in the lead up to and during the term of office of Australia's 20th century prime ministers and their biographers. And what I wanted to find out was who wrote the biographies, why did they write them, what was the intention, what was the dynamic between the biographer and their subjects. And for living prime ministers, towards the end of the 20th century, I interviewed both the subjects and the biographers to try and really unpick that political dynamic. But Frank, you've written a much more, obviously, big political history of Australia. What was in your mind as you approached your book?
Not very much, really, Chris. My book's biographical in some ways too. I mean, it's full of portraits of individuals. It's often driven by studies of personality, but it is a broader political history. It begins, we might call earliest times, or the earliest human occupation of the continent. So I begin with pre-contact Aboriginal societies, and I take it through, I was furiously writing on the 2 weekends after the May election last year to bring my conclusion up to date, because I'd finished it before the election. So it is a broad history, but it too is inhabited by personalities. I suppose, look, I can tell you the questions I had in mind. They were, what have Australians expected and demanded of their political system, or systems, if you like? How have they gone about realising those aspirations and ambitions, and how has the system responded to them? I mean, they were always the questions I had sort of sitting in the back of my head during the project. And so I was very keen to talk about not just political leadership and parties and institutions, but also, I guess, political movements and personalities and individuals, a kind of politics from below.
And that's kind of classic ANU history, isn't it? Because the School of History at ANU historically has been intimately entwined with biography. One of arguably the greatest collective social science project of scholarship in Australia is the Australian Dictionary of Biography. And, we're in the corridor with the ADB and the workers who produce it, and of course many of us are contributors to it. And what is biography? What is history? History inevitably is, good history anyway, includes real people, as yours does, Frank. and mine is kind of more people and less events focused. But essentially, I was looking at political biography as political intervention. What can a biography do to a politician's career trajectory? And of course, you go into bigger issues of policy. I suppose, I'm writing about the jet fuel pack that gave people a lot of agency and impact or not, and bombs that could be thrown at them along the way, whereas you have that broader focus. So I gotta say, folks, and as an unpaid agent of Harry Hartog, they make a very good complementary read, doesn't it?
Couple they make. Absolutely. You're quite right.
Do a box set.
What a nice couple. Now, being obviously, someone who would be a great staffer, so if anyone here would like to, sort of rescue me from being Professor of History here, I did put together some kind of questions and talking points. And the first one I put down was, how did we both probably, well, we didn't write this at the same time actually, because yours, I suppose, began its life as a thesis. Mine was sort of a kind of not allowed to tell people. Sorry, it didn't begin its life as that, and mine sort of limped along for a few years and was kind of completed under great stress during lockdown. But there is as with your biographies, as with the biographies that you study, there were contexts, right, for these two books. So they didn't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a particular political time, in a set of personal and political circumstances. How is your book shaped by context, by the circumstance? I mean, obviously there's one big important story that's almost a kind of trigger for your inquiry, so we should obviously share that one. But more generally, I mean, how did the political scene, as it is these days, shape your book?
So, of course, we think of recent politics as being particularly personal and very toxic in terms of personal attack. And the specific peg for my book was my proposed work on Julia Gillard, which I got an advance for from Alumni and had essentially completed and was kind of beginning to deal with the publisher about its release. And I opened my book with a short preface telling this story and explaining why I spiked the book and returned the advance just when it was poised to come out, which is a pretty radical thing to do, especially the handing back the advance bit.
It's extremely regrettable. You could have taken us all over to Badger and Co. for,
No, Frank, this was
burgers and beer after.
a few years ago. It was when advances were advances, not theoretical, kind of positions.
Yeah.
So what happened was the Allen and Unwin publicists explained to me there was a complete feeding frenzy around my book. The trajectory was I started it when Julia Gillard was a tremendously successful Deputy Prime Minister, commanded immense authority on the floor of Parliament, overshadowed Rudd really in terms of her parliamentary performance, and was a woman on the up. I was really interested in her because she was that very rare female politician who was unembarrassed about the naked pursuit of power. Now, this was a criticism of Gillard inside the party privately. She was seen more as a power monger than a values-driven politician. She wasn't exactly, and again, this was not spoken about because of caucus solidarity and feminist solidarity. It was not spoken about that she competed against other women in caucus in a very powerful, kind of unbridled way, in contrast to the other women who kind of stuck together and tried to rise together. So she was different, and this was a big reason, her being the breakout, the one who became Australia's first female Prime Minister. Fascinating subject, a woman on her way to the top. But after signing the book contract, things changed. Kevin Rudd fell, she became Prime Minister, and she got caught in this horrific pincer movement of attack, on the one hand from outside, from the Tony Abbott-led opposition. And you recall it, it was horrible. Ditch the Witch, Jewel IR, Alan Jones's shocking attack on her, saying she should be, her late father would be ashamed of her, and she should be thrown out to sea in a chaff bag. Really awful stuff. So that was coming at her from outside, but from within was a trenchant, bitter, treacherous attack from Kevin Rudd allies in caucus, who every time her prime ministership was on a smooth trajectory, they'd throw a bomb, they'd leak against her, they'd rev up the attacks. So it was a really awful situation. I'd never seen despite my many years in the press gallery, had never seen this kind of dual internal-external attack. And my book was about to be seized on, and some elements of it, I thought, probably bent and used as weapons against her in this really vicious, awful attack, and I didn't want to be a part of it. So I spiked it. And of course, in the years since, I've been asked hundreds of times, why did you spike the book? And I've never answered the question until I explain it in this preface. And my book is a response to that. I went back in history to try and see whether there were other biographers and other prime ministers in the same situation, what was really going on in that exchange. So I guess, Frank, in a broader context, this kind of descent into incredible animosity, kind of winner-takes-all politics instead of, it was never pretty Australian politics, I mean, as outlined in your book, but this seemed to really go to a new and bad place, and I just didn't want to be part of it.
I wish I had a story as lively as that. Although it must have been very difficult issues to negotiate in all sorts of ways. Firstly, no publisher in their right mind would pay me in advance that you'd really worry about paying back. And I'd also assume that any book I wrote would have absolutely no impact on the real world. So there's two differences already.
Not true.
That's just two differences. Look, the context in my book. Look, I delivered it late, inevitably, being incompetent and hopeless with deadlines. I delivered it late, and in retrospect, the best thing that could possibly.
Can I just interrupt there? Your actual reputation and perceptions of you in the ANU School of History have you on as a very reliable.
Wow, yeah. Obviously, they're not looking close enough at deadlines. So I delivered it excruciatingly late, and in retrospect, though, it was a jolly good thing because it's a post-COVID book. It's a book that takes account of the ways in which COVID both shaped or reshaped, changed, but more importantly, I think, exposed aspects of our political culture that you kind of might suspect existed, or you kind of knew about, or you thought were probably there, but which I think COVID, the experience of the pandemic, really brought out in stark colours in all sorts of ways. I mean, I often thought during COVID of a comment made by one of my mentors, the late John Hurst, who talked about Australians really being a very obedient people, was his phrase. And that's not the image that Australians like to have of themselves, do they? Larrikins, anti-authoritarians and all that sort of thing. Anyway, John would get up, when they'd give him the job at La Trobe University of speaking to the new international students, and he'd sort of take them into his confidence. So, I've got a secret for you. No one will tell you this, but they're really a very obedient people. And I think the pandemic disclosed that. It's not quite the right word. I've decided
it's totally the wrong word.
It's the wrong word.
Or it's kind of a take on a thing, but I would say the thing is different in nature. Like, I think one of the things that COVID showed was the great roots of historically weakening dramatically, but still evident early on in COVID, Australians' willingness, if things are explained to us, that there's a collective interest.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why
we will cooperate, which is really different from obedient.
Yeah, it's different. So,
but I think Hurst's politics maybe.
He was conservative, and the word obedience doesn't quite capture. I mean, I think it does capture an important reality. That is, a general inclination to observe the law, but it's based on popular consent, as you say, Chris. It is about a collective sense of welfare, but it's also about attitude to the state. It's a belief that the state, in the end, has a right to kind of make decisions about what it regards as a consensus or a collective welfare. I mean, we basically accepted the right of government to take a look at us all and to say what's in their best interest and what broadly are they going to accept and what broadly do they think is right. And then they do it, and then we do what we're told. And so it's not quite obedience in a raw sense, but it is a form of obedience. And
great illustration of the importance of specific words.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're here tonight. You're probably weird word people too. I know you kind of find each other, and you get into etymology and is it this word or that word? I mean, one of the revelations for me in the last couple of years has been hanging out with computer scientists a bit, has been the revelation that, oh my God, machine languages, they're so simple. Because we're wordy people, we're a bit kind of math averse and we think computer programming, oh no, scary. But actually, in computer programming, a term means something and only that thing every time it's ever used, varying only in terms of slight context. But we're here talking in English about the difference between obedience and cooperation. And, the English language is so infinitely complex, every single word, there are all subtle alternatives and even within a single word, variations in meaning. Folks, don't ever be awed by computer scientists. They've got it easy compared to historians.
Now, what about what we found in these books? What light do you reckon they shed on our political present? I mean, I was, really interested in how could the 2022 election, does it kind of vindicate the kinds of arguments I've put in this book? Does it contradict them? Is it a departure? Is it a continuation? What did you think?
Well, let's take a recent event and have a look. Let's take, say,
AUKUS.
So I think one of the unusual things about both our books is they span a long time for an Australian book, right? So you've got actually a decent data set. The words data set do not appear in either of our books.
Numbers.
Thinking as a social scientist.
Is an economist? Look, I can see an economist right there.
Yeah. There's more than one in the room. But settle. It's okay. We'll cope. One of the things you can get from our books is a great sweep of how things worked in our little polity and reflect on current contrasts. And I would say, taking AUKUS as an example, one of the things that's worked really well in Australian politics is the traditional Westminster system, where you have a permanent standing public service, where public servants are employed for life, and until this was disrupted in the 1980s, could give frank and fearless advice because they knew they couldn't be sacked, essentially. And changes brought in under the Hawke government by John Dawkins, which meant the end of permanent heads and what were permanent heads becoming secretaries on contract, was the beginning of the end. John Howard came in 96, shot 1/3 of the secretaries at dawn the weekend of the election. That sent the message, when I say jump, you say how high. And that led to this shocking decay during the quarter of a century in which the coalition was in power, except for 6 years, right? So we've ended up with this horrible kind of Washminster mess. Frank and Fearless is gone. Robo-Debt Royal Commission, you've all seen the evidence, it's just a bloody nightmare. And so I love that. Again, we don't spell it out in the book, but we lived in this world where you might not have liked, every public servant, and some of them couldn't conceal their politics. John Stone comes to mind. But by and large, you had a great quality public service, which did give frank and fearless advice to politicians who, on average, were made to look a lot better and govern way more competently than they would have otherwise absent of that system. So compare and contrast AUKUS, we've now reached the point where I think a very well-meaning, decent kind of a Labor Prime Minister has done the announcement of a policy, having skipped what would have been back in the day the green paper, kind of options paper for public discussion and feedback, feeding into a government white paper, which would be a considered statement of the government's likely direction based on the green paper and put out for consultation prior to an announcement and legislation. And the loss of that system has led to this debacle where a well-meaning Labor Prime Minister, still with his L plates on, I think, has made the announcement and expected everybody to sign up for it and fall into line obediently or cooperatively, to great detriment. And, the Keating torpedo below the line has got us all talking, hasn't it? Who's right? Who's wrong? The truth is, if the Albanese government had done the AUKUS policy development in a way more in line with what has worked so well for us historically, it wouldn't have done things like made me want to throw a brick at the television because I'm seeing an Australian Prime Minister on a stage in San Diego wearing Ray-Bans with a jumped-up Tory conservative British Prime Minister with a huge British flag, which just hits all of my buttons, Frank, honestly. And we wouldn't, if he'd stopped to buy Virginia-class subs from the Americans, that's one thing. British subs, would you buy a British car? No way. So
Harsh. I mean, what about an Aston Martin?
yeah. Well, look, there's a story. I weirdly follow stories about British shipbuilding, right? And a recent one earlier this year, this is dead set. This is not some kind of trash rumour on the internet. The Brits were doing an inspection of a British nuclear sub in dock that had been through a routine maintenance run, and one of the inspectors found a bolt on the coolant system pipes that had broken and should have been replaced. It had been superglued together, right? So if there'd been an old-fashioned green paper, white paper process, not called that because those terms haven't been used for a long time, but, substantive policy development, people like me could have said, Albo, don't be a fool, forget the British subs, right? And maybe drop that bit off. Or they could have gone, well, if we want a French sub, if we want a nuclear sub, the French have one on offer, and it saves us looking like those Anglosphere white guys again, But it didn't happen, and I think it's a huge loss.
It all goes back to the Beatles, really. They're all living in the shadow of a yellow submarine, maybe.
Okay.
I'd say
Who's Paul Keating's favourite Beatle?
Paul.
He's so brainy. How did you know that?
I just guessed.
Do you know why?
He was more a Tom Jones fan, wasn't he?
Did love Tom Jones, but his favourite Beatle was Paul McCartney because McCartney was so good at melody. So just briefly to square off an AUKUS, had Albo got the policy process right and in the right order, Paul Keating's trenchant criticisms would not have had, in my view, any purchase. And as Laura Tingle wrote on the weekend, you don't have to agree with Paul Keating's assessment of whether China's a threat or not, or other aspects of his argument, to know that he's raised some serious issues that were worthy of public information and debate ahead of making policy decisions. So I'm kind of a bit crushed by both sides, Frank, tonight, honestly. And I'm sick of being in a discussion around several universities going, is Paul right? Is Albo right? Actually, Albo ran a faulty process, and if he'd run a better process, Paul's criticisms wouldn't have had purchase. And my Keating chapter is fantastic, by the way.
It is. So's the Hawke one, I might add.
Thanks.
Still getting over that from years ago when I first read it. Yeah, look, I'd probably see AUKUS in those sorts of ways too. Also, I think, it's been foreign and defence policy in particular is, I think, especially subject to this. I mean, it's been a fundamentally elitist, undemocratic process, isn't it? Where government seems frightened, both governments that have dealt with this have seemed frightened to allow anything resembling a public debate. They sort of rev up their Canberra cheer squad in this think tank and that department at ANU and all the rest of it, and that there hasn't been a serious debate about the strategic aspects, about the
We need one.
and technological and all the rest of it. And so perhaps what happens in that situation is this kind of atavistic reversion, as you say, to forms of identity that are now called Anglosphere, but are basically a kind of nostalgic sort of Anglo-Saxonism in a way.
Yes, and
deriving in the English-speaking peoples and this sort of stuff.
deriving on a direct trajectory from a conservative government. And Labor is Labor doing just mindlessly following on Morrison-esque trajectories. I mean, it's a real worry. It's beyond the AUKUS issue. It's a question of, yes, we know as historians there's been a historic break in the way government works in Australia because of the shift to Westminster. And in my view, that's bad and that needs to be discussed and fixed. But there's a deeper issue, and that is there's actually a break in the transmission of the craft of effective politics. Because historically we know from your book that there are some relatively recent governments that still remembered how to establish, structure and conduct a public debate that simultaneously raised the average kind of education and information levels of the press gallery and through them voters, and could then lead to sometimes difficult policy that they were prepared to persuade, argue for, and sign up people for, instead of just expecting us to behave obediently.
But obediently, really without our consent, because there was no debate.
Correct.
There was no engagement.
Correct.
Which brings us to the next thing I wanted to raise, and that's the difference. What does good and bad government look like in an Australian context, perhaps historically and also in the more recent past?
What do you reckon? What's your favourite period? What do you think is our most effective political period when you look back on the last 120 years since Federation?
I think there's 3 or 4 that have been effective in different ways. I mean...
What's your favourite, though?
Oh, my favourite?
Your emotional favourite?
My emotional favourite? My emotional favourite's probably Curtin, I think. The mobilisation of the country in that way, that rapid mobilisation, the ways in which the government was able to do things and went ahead and did things that had completely destroyed, or the attempt to do it had destroyed previous governments, and they took advantage of the circumstances to make drastic changes that actually turned out to be utterly transformative of Australian life. I'm thinking there of the regulation of banking, which had destroyed the Scullin government during the Depression, to great cost of many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Australians. Within a few weeks in 1942, the Curtin government did what the Scullin government would have loved to have done. And that would be transformative. It meant that, when you get into the Chifley and then the Menzies era, the governments were able to bring about, or help to bring about, social outcomes like massive increases in home ownership, for instance, being one example, that had simply been impossible previously. And so I think that legacy is it's an underestimated legacy, because we think of, the victory in the war as the most significant legacy of that government. But I think I'm with John Edwards, I think, who wrote a book on this some years ago. I think that there's actually probably much other things that are of no less importance, actually.
Now, that's a really interesting choice, and probably many people here tonight are going, Curtin, yeah, right on. And one of the great things about being here and being with you, and we being part of this institution and the general kind of Canberra Terriot, is that a thing? I think I just invented that. Is that the links, here we are in 2023, but as you were talking about that, I was thinking about a former ANU Chancellor, Kim Beazley, who recently told me, he said, Dad told me, and of course Dad is Kim Beazley Senior, who was Education Minister in the Whitlam government, and came in around that kind of...
He succeeded period in his seat, in his own seat, 1945.
There you go. And that's where Frank and I are different. He's so on top of every detail. There's another complimentary thing about us, Frank. Together we're greater than our individual parts. I'm +1 = 3.
I was wrong, but anyway.
But Kim said, Dad told me that Curtin had told him that... Kim told me that his father had told him if Curtin had been alive instead of dying when he did, he didn't think bank nationalisation would have gone ahead, the attempt, and that Labor would have won the 49 election. Can you imagine if Menzies had not won in 49? One of the surprises in my book, if you read it, is the Menzies chapter, which is called Menzies Biography Mystery, explains how we've kind of got this contemporary idea of Menzies as this popular, world-beating, incredibly loved Prime Minister. But actually, when he won in 49, most of his own party hated him. Dick Casey, the president of the Liberal Party, polled better than him in the polls. No press gallery journalist could be induced to go and work for him as press secretary because they all thought he couldn't win the next election. That's where Menzies was at. So if Kim Beazley Senior's thesis that if Curtin hadn't died, he would have stopped Chifley from going ahead with bank nationalisation, and Labor may well have won the 49 election. It's an intriguing counterfactual, and may well have saved us from some incredible British Philistinism throughout the 50s. We might have had Dick Casey as Liberal opposition leader and ultimately Prime Minister, and could have had a very cultured alternative.
Well, Australia would have recognised the People's Republic of China in 1950 if that had happened, without doubt. We would have followed Britain. Well, it would have followed Britain in doing it. Was Britain did. And Australia would have followed Britain in doing so. It was its policy to do so. So that raised best and worst prime ministers.
Who's your best? Give me your worst first.
My worst? Well, my worst is Tony Abbott.
Listen, Scott Morrison.
Yeah, look, okay, there are arguments both ways there, but look, this is what I'd say. Morrison will always have the legacy of we didn't all die.
We certainly will.
We didn't all die in the COVID pandemic. Now, you can argue the toss about, his level of responsibility for that, but the reality is that, broadly speaking, he was immensely popular right to, I would have thought, the beginning of 2021. The economic policies he pursued, in collaboration, obviously, with other levels of governments, broadly worked, I think. We didn't end up with the kinds of scenario that we saw in other parts of the world in terms of mass death. Now, again, you can argue, right, we're an island, all the rest of it. But he will always be able to point to that. I'm not saying that's fantastic, but let's look at Abbott. Now, Abbott won, the coalition won the 2013 election for a majority of 30 in a house of 150, roughly. 150? 150. I mean, that's
151, I think.
That 151. That's one of the, that is a landslide victory.
Nearly 150 or 151.
Whatever.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 150. Well, any stretch of the, anyway, it's a big win, right? It's huge. It's enormous. It's an enormous win. I mean, how do you get kicked out by your own party 2 years later? I mean, it is an extraordinary episode. And not even rap managed that.
What's your answer in the book?
What's that about? Why or how? Well, I mean, he
probably held back.
Well, he proved utterly ill-equipped to run a country. It was a classic case of choosing someone. Well, he was chosen by one vote because, he would provide a vigorous opposition. Well, he provided a vigorous opposition, but he's also, I think, one of the, and this will be even more controversial, I think he was actually also one of the poorest opposition leaders in this country's history. Now, I know that's counterintuitive because he won the election and all the rest of it, but the reality is he was such a poisonous opposition leader, he made it impossible for himself to govern. I remember listening to John Faulkner many years ago, 20-odd years ago it would be, and he said, it was a talk he was giving, it was up in New England. I remember he said, there are two things oppositions need to do. They have to hold the government accountable, and you could argue Abbott did that in a kind of way. Accountable is probably not quite the word, but he certainly opposed. But they're the government in waiting. They have to prepare for governments. And Abbott simply failed to do that. I mean, the contrast with Whitlam, I think, is striking there. This is someone who did manage to demolish a succession of prime ministers, or at least, did a pretty good job of it, but he was preparing for government while he was doing this. And so I think Abbott's period in opposition, is a large part of the explanation for how poorly he performed in government. But the reality is he proved to utterly ill-equipped for national leadership. And so I'd rate him the worst. I'd rate him behind McMahon because of the utter lack of substance in terms of his legacy. And I'd rate him behind Morrison because I think for all Morrison's failures, there is the pandemic, which at least is a kind of ambiguous legacy. That's my view.
Well, Frank, this is where, historians, structure versus agency, right? This is where agency really comes into its own. You point out correctly that Tony became opposition leader by one vote. Remember the circumstances. Joe Hockey was so confident about becoming opposition leader, there was actually a meeting in his office planning tactics that Julie Bishop was at that allegedly, and I'm pretty confident this is right, someone piped up, so who will we make deputy? of course, she was the deputy leader of the Liberal Party at the time. That's how confident hockey bros were that he was going to get up. And they had no idea that Malcolm Turnbull was going to throw his hat in the ring. The opposition leader who was on the way out. Had not Turnbull done that and split the vote, Tony Abbott wouldn't be Prime Minister. But he became opposition leader and Prime Minister. He was way worse than we all thought, right? You didn't expect Abbott to be that bad, did you? You thought he'd be like a DLP-ish.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be so. In fact, you can go back. I wrote stuff at the time, basically foreshadowing this kind of moderate centrist to, I didn't say how long I thought he'd be there, but I would have guessed about 8 years. Yeah.
So I ran into him at Art Oven, the early opener cafe in Monaca on Franklin Street. It was the weekend after the election.
Did you say?
And him. He was sitting in his lycra, being a mammal, on the side at one of the sidewalk chairs and tables. And of course, being a hail fellow, well-met kind of historian, I said, "Tony, how's it going?" And of course, we'd known each other since he was John Hewson's press secretary in the early 90s. And I, at that time, was working for The Australian, and Tony was refreshing as a press secretary because all the other Liberal press secretaries back in the early 90s were all a bit prissy and neat and shiny, rosy cheeked. And then in comparison, Tony would rock up to the desk, these little kind of legs of land hanging off his shoulders, sleeves rolled up, muscles bursting out. And I thought, great, what a refreshing difference. Anyway, why did Tony end up being such a bad Prime Minister? This is partly a biographical question. It has not been answered. I would argue it's not a biographical question that can be answered on its own. And I will make that point through this anecdote. During the Gillard-Rudd turmoil, I remember getting on the plane in Melbourne to fly to Canberra, and the plane was late. It was held up by 2 people who were late getting on board. Now, I was sitting in the front row of economy, and eventually up the aisle through business came first Tony Abbott, opposition leader Tony Abbott. And he was hunched over. He looked like a serf. He was carrying bags. He kind of stumbled up in his, oh, my testicles are gigantic, and just walking is difficult without rocking from side to side kind of gait. And had these bags, put them in the overhead lockers and sat down. And then about 90 seconds later, this extraordinarily and physically very impressive Amazon strode down the aisle of business. Peter Credlin, his chief of staff, and sat next to Tony Abbott. Now, as a biographer, I've got to say, I was agog. This told me a lot about the Tony Abbott opposition leadership office, the dynamics between he and his chief of staff, who was up, who was down, and can I say, everything we know about how the Prime Ministership was run makes that a very relevant anecdote. But Frank, there's more. How did Peter Credlin become that person? Because Peter Credlin came from the moderate wing of the Victorian Liberal Party originally. She was known as a completely innocuous and reasonable person. She worked for Senator Kay Patterson, again a Victorian moderate, a very nice woman, very solid senator. How did Peter Credlin become Peter Credlin, and how did Tony Abbott become the baggage slave of his chief of staff? Now, they're really interesting questions to ask and answer along the way of sorting out the Abbott Prime Ministership.
There's a research agenda there, isn't there? My God.
Any potential PhD students listening, I'm interested in supervising on this topic.
Lovely. My goodness. Which brings, it's great that you've raised Peter Credlin there, because a question I wanted to ask you, Chris, and you've written on this and you work in this area, is the whole issue of women in Australian politics. It's been such a hot button issue in the last, certainly the last 5-6 years. Why do you think? What is there something distinctive about Australia's political culture that has made this kind of resiliently difficult issue?
I'm going to answer that, Frank, but we have skipped through your best Prime Minister, so I'm just flagging now. We're coming to that next. Okay, so get thinking.
We got baggage, didn't we? That's right. That's right. We got lost in the baggage. That's a good point. Yeah.
So in my book, I do the whole of the 20th century and I stop at Howard and Keating and Howard, right? So I don't do the 21st century prime ministers. But in my conclusion, I do return to the Gillard theme. And I basically argue that Australia's caught in this kind of trap in that respect, in that we've only had one woman prime minister and everyone got PTSD from the experience, right? And we've still got it. The enemy, the self-interested enemies of women in politics and women as prime ministers can conveniently go, look at Gillard, right? And then they don't need to go on. The unspoken bit is, it was traumatic, it was a disaster, don't go there, right? And if you push back on that a bit, then the next thing they say is, but Queensland. Now, those two things have got a kind of lock on the woman as prime minister, woman as alternative leader at the federal level in our nation, and it is so noxious. Not least because, to take the second point first, Queensland. The current Premier of Queensland is a woman. She's been elected 3 times in a row, except for one brief male Liberal Premier before her. Before her, there was another female Labor Premier who was elected and successfully ruled. Queenslanders are fine voting for Labor women, but there's this idea that Queensland is full of rednecks and they'd never accept a woman. It is complete rubbish and self-serving rubbish propagated by people who are mostly alternative leaders who are male. So until we can kind of bust out of this unfortunate Gillard self-serving for some PTSD kind of syndrome and have more women prime ministers like other countries have. There are so many countries now who've had 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 women prime ministers, and it's normalised. Here we're still kind of caught in this mindless trap. Frank, who's your favourite prime minister?
So, I don't know if I had one who I could say is the best. I mean, I think in terms of legacy, the most substantial was Whitlam, particularly given the shortness of the term of office. I think in terms of the broad range of skills required to do the job and to do it successfully over a long period, I'd probably say Hawke, I think. Howard was clearly a very successful Prime Minister in a range of ways, whether you agree with what his policies or not. I mean, his management, for instance, of the people around him was clearly very, very skilled, as skilled as Hawke's, I'd say. So in terms of the kind of technical skills of being a Prime Minister, Hawke and Howard, hard to judge. I mean, Menzies did it for a very long time, but I don't know, maybe in the 1950s and early 60s, the challenges of doing so were of a different order, perhaps. I mean, I don't buy the idea that Menzies did nothing. Of course, that's untrue. But it's striking that a lot of things that were important that happened during that very long period are hard to pin on Menzies. Even some of the big foreign policy decisions and so on were often coming from elsewhere.
Fun fact about Menzies: the second time round after his disastrous failed first prime ministership, when his own cabinet expelled him because he was so crap at managing government during World War II, the next time round when there was a leadership context on that side of politics, Billy Hughes, who was about 1,000 not out, nearly beat him. Seriously, he was already ancient Billy Hughes, and he came within an ace of becoming the leader instead of Menzies. And had not Conservative senators voted more for Menzies than Hughes, Hughes would have won. That's, like, you're going to be gripped by the Menzies chapter. Just saying.
That's right. Be gripped by the whole book. Look, I presume we need to go to questions about now, right? 45 minutes, is that right? Yeah. So look, I'm just going to ask one more question before we do that, which is, and this could bring in any range of issues, but what's the Australian political system going to look like in 50 years, Chris?
Wow. I know what I'd like it to look like. Like, in my dream, this is my fantasy. Let's do the woo graphic and imagine in our dreams what it could be like. I would like to see the people back in the system who understand historical value and significance and vital importance of traditional Westminster government restore it. Now, that's a really hard thing to do. So let's put it in more contemporary terms. If you do some systems thinking on the APS, get rid of contracts, get rid of performance pay, bring back permanence. Don't confuse that system with never being able to change a departmental head. All it means is, if you're not happy with the one you've got, think about it carefully before you do something. Don't do it too often, but send them on gardening leave. Make them High Commissioner to Wellington. Do something like that, as was done for decades to great effect, and get rid of this shocking Washminster system, which has led to a severe degradation of the APS, a ridiculous amount of outsourcing to people who charge too much, give rubbish advice, and are taking us down fast. I would like, Frank, that to be restored as the main strut underneath our beautiful system, which features wonderful things like compulsory voting. I love it. Preferential voting. I love it. And if you want to know how good those things are, take a look at Britain's first past the post system, which is yielding catastrophic government, taking Britain pretty much down the drain.
So it's an adapted Westminster system, by the sounds of it, or our particular version of Westminster that you like.
Bring back what worked and served us so well, before it got messed with during the great iconocratic wave that began in the 80s.
Yes. Well, all I'd add, I think, to that is I think it's very important that political parties in Australia much better conform to democratic norms. And I think they'll be forced to, actually. I think one of the consequences of the 2022 election is if they don't, they're going to be repeatedly outflanked by well-organised independents who will, and minor parties for that matter, who'll displace them because they don't. I mean, the AEC supervises union elections, but it doesn't supervise party elections. Now, why is that? Well, we all know why that is, because it's a kind of cartel that, between the major political parties to ensure they don't get proper scrutiny and don't have to conform to democratic norms. So I'd like to see that happen. I think I'm reasonably optimistic that I think things will head in that direction around obviously party finance, campaign finance. But it may be a slow process.
Systems integrity is always a good thing. So any comments, questions, arguments?
Yes.
Anyone want to get up and say you're Peter Credlin's cousin and you know the reason why she changed?
That's it. Yeah.
Chris, I like that story about Tony Abbott and Peter Credlin. I had exactly the same experience on aircraft.
2 data points, but
And maybe it was the same flight, but I want to just go back to AUKUS. And the point that I really am upset about was the Labor Party agreed within 24 hours of the initial announcement from the Morrison government about the AUKUS scheme, and there was obviously no debate, no carrying on and analysis. And here, is there any other example in the political history of Australia of the Labor Party acquiescing or one side of politics acquiescing so markedly to the other side of politics? And I wondered at the time whether it was just because the Labor Party didn't want to cause any ructions or any difficulties with the forthcoming election. So they just laid down and said yes.
that's exactly what happened. And in my book, How to Win an Election, if they'd read it, and many say they followed it pretty closely, that's exactly the right thing to do. Go along with AUKUS, because you want to fight the election on your issues, not their issues, right? If Labor had disagreed with AUKUS at that point, there would have been a gigantic foreign policy fight, and it would have helped the Conservatives get re-elected. Everyone's got to remember that the Albanese Labor opposition has a majority of 2 seats. That's up against, objectively, the worst government since Federation in the Morrison government. That was an extremely narrow win. And to win an election, really, you've got to make everything just align and get you across the line. It's what you do then that really matters. And Labor has missed the opportunity so far it may have to revisit it and actually go and do its homework and get its things in the right order now. Who knows? We'll see. But AUKUS, when you look at it, is simply a defence material purchasing agreement for something that might happen in the future, right? And it's been taken for with political purposes and had the Christ beaten out of it for political effect in a way that's unnecessary. We're in a really serious situation, and when I talk passionately about the APS being returned to Westminster principles of operation, I really, really care about this. Australia's arse is hanging out security-wise. We've had a quarter of a century of insane defence material purchasing decisions, leading to this hodgepodge of bits and pieces equipment, either not delivered, cancelled, or delivered late, over budget, and not with a very high degree of functionality or integration. It's catastrophic, not least because it has not been linked to a coherent strategic policy. Now, that is what actually is making Australia very vulnerable, irrespective of who you think the threat is. It's one of the most vital areas to get right, and Labor has got to go back and do it properly from TORS with proper support, not follow this slack, politically convenient route that makes me want to throw a brick at the television, in my humble opinion. Frank? There's an argument for going nuclear. There are arguments for going against it. But what there's not an argument for is, if you're going to decide that we need nuclear subs, getting rubbish subs too late to matter when there are better alternatives that don't lock us into a noxious old white guy's Anglosphere look in the region. One of the virtues of the French nuclear sub offering is its nuclear module is plug in, plug out. You don't need a domestic nuclear industry. You can sail the bugger to France, pull out the nuclear module, get them to stick a new one in, and they come back, right? A lot simpler, a lot better in terms of our independent foreign policy, faster, sooner. Why wouldn't you go that route? You wouldn't go that route if you just wanted the slack announcement effect of large flags in San Diego, rather than doing the hard grind of working up the options properly, having a public debate, securing good policy, and then selling it.
Thanks tremendously for the conversation. I'm a retired public servant, and I was relieved to actually retire because the culture had changed so much. So I'm very much with Chris about the Westminster system, and I was imbued with principles of administrative law and the separation of powers doctrine. So it was very demoralising, towards the end. I'd been around long enough to be able to have a more longitudinal experience of the deterioration of the culture. But I do hope now to live long enough to see our system of government become a republic. So I just wonder whether you've got some views about how that might unfold and the appropriateness of it.
I had that as a question here. We didn't quite get to it. Republic. So, I think a lot's going to depend on the phase of constitutional change in this term, won't it? The voice, the First Nations voice. If that does get up, and I think that's very uncertain for a whole range of obvious reasons, it's become very contentious. I couldn't see a Labor government pursuing a republic issue. I think if the voice gets up, that it may well create the momentum for Labor to take up if they get a second term, to take up the issue of a republic. It remains a difficult issue because of the same reasons as the late 90s. What kind of model? I don't think you'll ever get up, again, John Hurst is good on this, I don't think you'll ever get up a proposal that's not for a direct election model. And ARM, Australian Republic Movement, as it calls itself now, I think has accepted that. But that remains a very contentious model, I think, amongst, sort of political elites, the kind of Canberra insider class who persist in the notion that it's going to somehow destroy Westminster democracy. I don't believe that myself. I'm not going to go into the reasons why I don't believe it here, but I don't believe that myself. But yeah, look, I think it's going to depend on what happens with the voice, actually, whether that will become an issue that Labor's likely to take up down the track.
So I just said that one very smart thing Anthony Albanese did was resisted pressure to bring the Republic forward too quickly and to do the voice first. And I think there's going to be hard lessons for the government over the fate of the voice. I think people have forgotten how hard it is to get a referendum up and what you've actually got to do that. Hell, there could be a connection between that and not doing your policy development process properly. Gee.
Yeah.
But I will say this, he's made it more likely that the Republic will happen by doing the voice first and separating it out. So I hope it happens too, in commiseration with your experiences as a public servant. I know it's terrible. A lot of very good people in Canberra are very traumatised by what's happened. But folks, there's hope. Who stopped robo-debt in the end? A public servant. The most magnificent day of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission testimony was Renee Leon explaining how, when she was absolutely certain that it was illegal and she couldn't get government ministers to actually hit the stop button, in the end, a public servant fulfilled their statutory responsibilities and stopped it. Go APS.
Thanks both of you for your discussion and for your books. Chris, I share your nostalgia for the good old days of green paper and white paper and proper parliamentary debate and so on. But I think Frank agrees, did we ever do that with defence material acquisition or for defence and foreign policy? They've always been fairly opaque and mysterious arts, and I wanted both of you to comment on, both in respect of defence material acquisition, but also climate change, the power of vested interests and what's happening behind the scenes with the forces on governments from vested interests in a time where they can get up an information campaign or a disinformation campaign through social media, through multiple channels very, very quickly. And how does the green paper, white paper, proper parliamentary debate, which we don't even have to go to war, operate in that broader context?
I don't want to paint the picture that there was ever a perfect world, but some things were legally underpinned, like permanency in the public service. So that's an absolute. In terms of green papers, white papers, it was a tendency. Even when those terms were dropped, you could still evidently see those processes until they stopped. And they basically stopped in the mid-period of the Howard government. I was the cabinet historian for the release of the 2000 and 2001 cabinet papers, and it was fascinating to me to look at the 500 or so cabinet documents in those 2 years that were made available to me, and you could actually see a remnant, credible bureaucratic operation going on in terms of advice. But it really went downhill fast from the early 2000s, pretty much from the War on Terror on, and notably there are no documents on a number of controversial aspects of the Howard government in that period. So in terms of tendencies, we need to go back in that direction and away from the direction Howard took us, in my view, in terms of government.
I mean, I might even go back further than that. I mean, you could still have a meaningful debate about foreign and defence policy in the Labor Party to about the mid-80s, I would have thought. And I'm thinking there, I mean, think of the MX missile affair, which is 80.
Glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, people misremember this because they think it was, Hawke came up with this thing and, it was somehow knocked over by the left. Well, no, it was actually knocked over by the right and the left. It was a functioning political party where the various factions knew that their room for manoeuvre on an issue like that was constrained by the power bases they had in branches and in unions. And so it was as much the right as the left that basically, forced Hawke into a situation where he had to go back to the Americans and say, no, we're not going to test your missiles off our East Coast. And one thinks back even to the vigour of the debate around nuclear issues and uranium. it was very vigorous, wasn't it? What's now the QT, what was it, the Lakeside at the 1984 National Conference with, it verged on kind of violent, actually. There was, I think, much more vigorous debate. You need a party from below. There was something hollow and meaningless, I think, about some of the discussion a few days ago where people were talking about, people in the branches won't like AUKUS. Well, it's not going to make any difference because the branches aren't going to be able to exercise influence anymore. They don't. They're not strong enough to be able to do that in a way that they could over issues like uranium and missile testing or whatever in the 1970s and 80s, which brings us back to the point I made about democratic political parties. I think we need much better. We need political parties that are actually much more a part of a democratic system than they are at the moment.
I'm so glad you brought up MX, and we haven't got to climate yet. That's really important. But the MX missile crisis is critical because it showed the immune system of the Labor Party across all levels reacting appropriately to correct a bad decision, right? That's what has gone wrong historically in Labor is the Rudd government presidential system where the autocratic leader dictates and cabinet went along with it for political reasons. Now, we're at this exquisitely delicate moment now where Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who's, I wake up in the morning and think, thank God Scott Morrison lost office and is not Prime Minister. So I'm not diminishing the Prime Minister's achievement. But my sense is, and everything I hear, is that pretty much the operations of the government is delimited by the operations of Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister and his office. Now, I'm desperately hoping we are not behind the scenes seeing a situation develop where cabinet members are timid in taking on bad policy and bad process and making sure it gets corrected and doesn't continue. Because if this government walks down the Rudd route, it'll be bad. Now, we didn't know what was happening in the Rudd government for a long time because of Labor internal loyalty, that everyone shut up about it, that Rudd was ruling the roost and everyone was going along. It's going to be fascinating to find out how things are really operating in the Albanese government. Let's hope it's a lot healthier than that. Do you want to take climate change?
Well, the only thing I'd add there, Chris, is one of the issues with Rudd too was the way in which ministers kind of disappeared into their own portfolios, and that was a function in a way of Rudd's style. There was a kind of a decline of a sense of collective ownership of the government, and I think at the moment that there aren't too many signs of that in this present government, but it's something you'd want to watch out for because I think that's a danger.
I think AUKUS is going to be a big test. I suspect that for reasons of political quietude, will continue on for a while. But what's happening under the hood to stop that kind of crap policy on the run, announcement first, policy work later approach? If we keep seeing that, it's going to be bad. And there are other catastrophic areas of government failure, like public health policy, amidst a sea of other great policy successes. So I guess, Frank, it's still a learner government, not even in for a year. So we'll see what happens. Climate change, yes, massive. What do we need? We need a lot more and better climate policy. The question is how it unfolds, because who wouldn't like to say yes, go Greens, hammer Labor, and make them be better? But we've seen that before. If it leads to Labor losing office, then all it does is just deliver more coalition government. So I'm all for collaborative competition between Labor and the Greens. The kind of competition that keeps getting Labor elected, but with pressure for better climate policy, stronger climate policy, but in a way that sticks. And I know it's a crisis. I know it's like 1 second to midnight. But if the alternative, as we've seen over the last quarter century, where the coalition's been in power for 20 of the last 26 years, then it's not going to lead to better climate policy. So dynamic situation, watch this space.
Must be almost there, are we? Are we at for an hour? I think that's we got. Sorry, is there more questions? Oh, sorry. Yep. Teal. Oh, I sort of, I didn't say teal, but I do. They don't like the word. That the community independence, I'm told, is
Because some are orange, not teal. Like the rural independence seem to be on.
they prefer. I believe they prefer community independence.
Might need a whole nother night on it.
That actually comes straight into the comment that I was going to make, because what struck me about your list of effective prime ministers is that every one of them basically had a life before they went into politics. And this was something that Menzies was emphatic about, that people should not go into politics unless they've proven themselves somewhere else. And I'm struck by the Teals as, leaving aside arguments about terminology, as essentially reflecting the electorate coming to that same conclusion, and against the background of the increasing dominance within the major parties of people who are part of a political insider class who have never really lived in the real world, because they've gone straight from being young Labor or young Liberal to think tanks to parliamentary staffer positions to pre-selection. And then when you get the critical element in that is the Members of Parliament Staff Act, which effectively creates all these jobs in ministerial offices and MPs' offices where these people can be incubated. And again, that then ties in with the issue about the hollowing out of the public service, because you get a class of people into Parliament who think they know it all and don't really want any sort of advice that's going to be inconvenient to their political ambitions. I have hopes that the Royal Commission in Robodebt is going to go beyond just looking at what happened in that case. I do like the Fitzgerald Commission in Queensland and look at the entire enabling environment which brought us to that state of affairs. So it's going to be very interesting, but I'd welcome your comments.
Yeah, I agree with that. Many people around town think a Royal Commission into the public service would be a good idea.
There's one in the
Yeah, that's right. But hopefully it will be unnecessary. Hopefully the right conclusions will be drawn from Robodebt. Max Weber has a great concept, the occasional politician. And I think the Teals are an expression, and people like Cathy McGowan and her successor Helen Haynes, who are orange, are examples of this. The Liberal Party, probably you've guessed tonight, I'm not exactly a sign-up member of the Liberal Party. Nevertheless, I argue strenuously to everyone who'll listen, you've got to have the best people in the best possible parties across politics that you can. We live in a democracy, thank God. Governments change. Whoever's in, you want them to be a lot better than the Liberals were last time, right? But all of those Teals, they're women, right? They couldn't survive in the contemporary Liberal Party that is so misogynist and hideous. And so, to me, the Teals and the Oranges are a bit like the immune system of the Liberal Party reacting, and Liberal voters sending the kind of people they normally would have sent 30, 40, 50 years ago, sensible Liberal moderates with a professional background, into Parliament. Now, what government in its right mind would not like Dr. Monique Ryan as their health minister? She is outstanding. Do all parties need more people like that? They do. However, if you look at the current Labor front bench, it's extraordinarily strong. It's a really good high-quality front bench. Several really strong alternative leaders for down the track. Some of them have that kind of noxious profile you mentioned of going into staffing a bit early, going into politics a bit early. Sometimes it really works out. So I think there can be good and bad of both kinds. We just need better across the board always and more often in the future.
I'd agree with that. It's kind of a matter of balance. I noticed Gary up there who said this, so I hope you don't mind me quoting you, Gary, but you pointed out, politics calls on a range of skills, and if you're assembling a group of staffers around you, you want to have the right skills for the job, and it's not surprising that they're the same skills that are involved in actually establishing your own political career. So, in a sense, I wouldn't be down on the idea of that kind of pathway. I think it's and we've had professional politicians since the year dot. I mean, in all honesty, a figure like Paul Keating. I mean, he was in Parliament at 25. But John Howard was effectively a professional politician too. So, they've been around a long time. I think what the system has lacked is space for those novel forms of public leadership to which you refer. I'm very struck, and I've written a little bit on this, about the ways in which, I think in quite deliberate ways, the committee that chooses Australian of the Year has clearly been using it to foster novel forms of public leadership that aren't well represented within the mainstream political system. And I think that has been an extraordinary success. I think that is one of the really great successes in Australian public life of the last decade. You don't have to agree with all of them and think they're all splendid to see that has actually enhanced Australian public culture. And in a way, I see the Teals and community independence as a part of that kind of trend of different new forms of public leadership that are now, I think, positively finding a place within the political system or the parliamentary system itself. And I think that is a very positive thing.
And I'm now going to show leadership on behalf of us both, Frank, by drawing things to a close. One more question.
More, I see.
Gee.
How do we train leaders, women leaders? I'm a graduate, I went into government of the in-service. I think we should have a degree in leadership because Julia Gillard has put a global thing of leadership. I have rung lots of telephone numbers and got lots of recorded messages. I eventually got onto someone that told me, well, the leadership really, we might have a few Australians, but it's really for the Pacific women. And where is this money and how do we train leaders? I think we should have a 3-year course on leadership within the politics course because it's so important.
Till then, check out Google Pathways to Politics. There's a big program being funded by Carol Schwartz in Melbourne. It's being run in Canberra for the first time this year, in fact. So don't give up hope. Stuff is happening.
There's also McKinnon Institute now, which basically educates new politicians, which is another initiative around leadership. So that there is stuff happening in the space. Yeah.
And one of the great things about the last election was incredible women who were never politicians, never dreamt they would be, got up. And other women helped them get there. And other men who were sick of the Liberal Party being a refuge for extremists and religious oddities. I mean, I think there's a lot of hope in our current system. I think there are some fantastic trajectories both sides. I think the coalition's got a lot more work to do on itself than Labor, but bring it on. You know what's not happening, folks? We're not locked in concrete in some dire negative multiplier situation. There's action, there's hope, there's change. Let's all go for it. Frank, keep writing great books.
You too, Chris.
Thanks.
You too, Chris.
And thank you for you, terrific audience. We love you, Canberrans. Keep coming, keep reading, keep thinking. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Well.